Okay, so I'll be continuing with what was taken last class, and that is Shylock's justification or reason for insisting on taking his pound of flesh rather than money. He has no forgiveness, he is heartless. And then he says, there are people who dislike pigs, there are people who hate cats, not for, and there isn't any reason as to why they hate cats or pigs. And then he goes on to say that people's likes and dislikes are fickle and it kind of depends on the person's mood. And he says there is no real reason for as to why they hate or like a particular thing. And he says, similarly, I too cannot give you any reason except for the fact that I've always had this loathing, I've always hated Antonio. And he says, that is the answer I'm going to give you. And he says, is that enough of an answer? Now, all this while, Bassanio has been listening to this reply, and Bassanio steps in and he says, this is no answer, thou unfeeling man, to excuse the current of thy cruelty. He says, this is not enough, and this is not enough answer, this is not a good answer. And this answer does not excuse you, excuse your cruelty. You are a very cruel person, he says. And Shylock says, I am not bound to please thee with my answer. He says, I have no intention of answering you, and my answers are merely answers. I do not really have to please you. There is no need for me to satisfy you with any answers. And then Bassanio says, do all men kill the things they do not love? Do people kill things that they instantly dislike? There are a lot of things that we like and we don't like. There are a lot of people that Shylock says, don't people like to kill the things they hate? Naturally, everyone would like to kill the things that they hate. So this is the answer that Shylock gives Bassanio when Bassanio asks him whether men would prefer killing things that they dislike. Here, and then Bassanio says, every offense is not a hate at first. He says, not every act of wrongdoing must lead to hate. We do not automatically hate a person who does something wrong to us. And he says, each act of wrongdoing should not lead to hate. And at that instant, Shylock says, what? Wouldst thou have a serpent sting thee twice? And immediately says, imagine, would you let a snake bite you twice? If a snake has bitten you once, won't you naturally dislike that snake, and won't you naturally want to kill it before it attacks you or bites you again? And now Antonio has had enough. Antonio talks to Bassanio and he says, I pray you, think you question with a Jew. He says, are you trying to reason with this man? Are you trying to change this man's mind? It's not possible, he says. You may as well go stand upon the beach and bid the main flood bait his usual height. He says, it'll be easier, it'll be easy for you to go and stand on the beach and tell the tide, whether it is a high tide, not to come in as high as it usually would come, because that is something that is natural, that will not change. Similarly, this man's nature, he is cruel and hard-hearted by nature, and he is not going to change. Similarly, just like we will be unable to change nature. For example, the high or the low tide. Similarly, it's impossible. It's not possible to reason with such a man. And then he goes on to say, you may as well use question with the wolf, why he hath made the ewe bleed for the lamb. You might as well ask the wolf why he makes a ewe cry by eating the lamb, because it's in the wolf's nature. He does not really think about the ewe when it eats the lamb. And he says, you may as well forbid the mountain pines to wag their high tops and make no noise when they are frightened. when they are threatened with the sorry, I've lost the lines. When they are threatened with the gusts of heaven. Now he's talking about the mountain pines. Now mountain pines are like those really large trees, kind of like the Christmas trees that you would see, and those are like in the Alps you'll find these huge pine trees. And these pine trees, they come with the pine cones, and they're so tall and they're so long that they have this natural, they sway with their high tops, and uh, each time they sway, each time there is a gust of wind that blows through these mountain pines, you hear a lot of sound. It makes a lot of sound, and it is something that is not going to change. It's never going to change. The mountain pines will always make those sounds when the wind blows through them. Similarly, he says, just like we cannot change the mountain pines from swaying, just like we cannot prevent the wolf from eating the lamb, just like we cannot, it's impossible for us to stop the high tide from coming. It's impossible for you to change this man's mind. He says, you may as well do anything most hard as seek to soften that which than which what's harder. And he says, you might as well as do anything impossible. All these things, even though they are impossible, still there is a possibility of making it possible. But if it's impossible to soften this man's Jewish heart, and he asks, is there anything harder than this man's heart? And then he says, therefore I do beseech you, make no more offers. Use no farther means, but with all brief and plain conveniency, let me have judgment, and the Jew his will. And he says, since it's impossible to change Shylock's mind, he has a hard heart. Instead, now there is nothing much we can do, so I'm pleading with you, do not plead, do not beg this man, and do not try to persuade him. Do not plead or make offers or try to persuade him. Rather, let him get what he wants. Let him get that pound of flesh that he has wanted. Let this man have his way, and let us not delay this any longer. Now, this is what Antonio tells Bassanio. And now Bassanio tries to offer Shylock a better, comes with a better offer for Shylock, and he says, for thy 3,000 ducats, here is 6. Now, Antonio owes Shylock 3,000 ducats, as is earlier mentioned. This is the amount that Antonio had borrowed from Shylock, and that amount he had borrowed for Bassanio. So now Bassanio owes it to his friend. Now Bassanio wants to save Antonio, and Bassanio says, for your 3,000 ducats, I have with me 6,000 ducats. Now that he is married to Portia, he is now a rich man, and he says, I have 6,000 ducats. But Shylock, he is not happy. He says, what judgment shall I dread, doing wherein 6 parts, and every part a ducat? I would not draw them, I would have my bond. And he says, uh, there is there is absolutely no way I'm going to listen to you. I'm not going to take your offer. He says, even if it were in 6 parts, if it were 6 times 6,000 ducats, I will still not take that amount, but instead I would still take what is legally owed to me. I would have my bond. How shall so the Duke has been listening to all this, and he says, how shall thou hope for mercy, rendering none? How can you hope for mercy if you don't show it yourself? And Shylock says, what judgment shall I dread, doing no wrong? What judgment? I am not scared of anything. I have not done anything wrong. Why should I worry about mercy? I do not need mercy because I am not the victim. I am not the person who has done anything wrong. Why should I worry about mercy when I have done nothing wrong? It is only a person who is guilty, a person who has committed a crime. He is a person who worries about mercy. Why should I worry about it? He says, you have among you many a purchased slave, which, like your asses and your dogs and mules, you use in abject and in slavish part, because you bought them. Shall I say to you, let them be free, marry them to your heirs? Why sweat they under burdens? Let their beds be made as soft as yours, and let their palates be seasoned with such viands. You will answer, the slaves are ours. So do I answer you. The pound of flesh which I demand of him is dearly bought. It is mine, and I will have it. If you deny me, fie upon your law. There is no force in the decrees of Venice. I stand for judgment. Answer, shall I have it? Now here Shylock says, you have amongst you you have purchased many slaves, and you use these slaves like donkeys, dogs, or mules, because you have bought them. Now if I were to tell you to free them, let these slaves, let them go, you set them free and marry these slaves to your children or your grandchildren. Why do you make them do hard work? Why don't you give them beds as soft as yours? Make them eat wonderful food just like yours. If I said that, you would say that the slaves are yours, and since the slaves are yours, you can do as as you want. Whatever you want, you can do, because you own them. You technically own them, and that is the answer you would give me. And he says, Shylock says, I'm giving you the same answer. I have bought the pound of flesh that I demanded from him. Now that is the deal between Antonio and myself. I had given him money, and he had promised to give me back the same amount by a certain period, but he has not been able to, and instead he had promised to give me his pound of flesh. Now that he cannot keep, he was unable to keep his promise. He has to give me his pound of flesh. Now I own that pound of flesh. Now that pound of flesh is my slave, he says. And just like you, once you've bought your slaves, you own them. Similarly, I now own that pound of flesh, which is Antonio's. So I own it. And he says, I have bought the flesh, that pound of flesh that I demanded from him. It is mine, and I will have it. And he says, it is mine, and I will have it. If you deny me, fie upon your law. There is no force in the decrees of Venice. I stand for judgment. Answer, shall I have it? Now he says, it is mine. What is mine? That pound of flesh is mine, and I will have it, he says. If you deny me what I deserve, this is my right, legally I am right, then your laws mean nothing. There is no justice in this place called Venice. There is no power to legal agreements. Nobody will believe in your authority. What is your opinion? He says, I stand for judgment. Answer, shall I have it? Tell me what your response is. Right, we'll continue with line 106. It begins with the Duke, who is quite angry with Shylock, and he says, upon my power I may dismiss this court, unless Bellario, a learned doctor whom I have sent for to determine this, come here today. Duke says, I have the power to dismiss this court unless Bellario, who is the doctor of law, is to come today. I have sent for him, and he will decide upon this case. And you have Celerio says, my lord here stays without a messenger with letters from the doctor new come from Padua. He says, Celerio says, there is a messenger standing outside with letters from Bellario, and he has just come from Padua. Duke immediately says, he calls for the messenger, and he says asks messenger to bring him the letter. And now Bassanio says, "Good cheer, Antonio, what man courage yet? The Jew shall have my flesh, blood, bones, and all. Earth, although shall lose for me one drop of blood." "Cheer up, Antonio, keep your courage," he says. "The Jew will have my flesh, blood, and bones before I let him take one drop of blood from you on my account." Now, Bassanio cannot imagine a future without Antonio, and he says, "I will not let anything happen to you." But Antonio, he seems rather cool, and he says, "I am tainted whether of the flock. I am tainted whether of the flock. Meat is for death. The weakest kind of fruit drops earliest to the ground. And so let me, you cannot better be employed, Bassanio, than to live still and write mine epitaph." Antonio, he says, "I'm like a diseased sheep in a flock, one who should die, who ought to die." And he says, "The weakest fruit drops earliest to the ground." And just like that, let me drop like that fruit which has grown weak, or let me die like a sheep that has got some kind of a disease. The best thing, he says, you can do, Bassanio, is to stay alive. I do not want you to die for me. He says, "It's better if you stay alive and write my epitaph." At this moment, you find Nerissa. She enters. She is disguised as a clerk, as a law clerk, and Duke addresses her and he asks her, "Came you from Padua, from Bellario?" "Are you from Padua?" he asks. "From Bellario." And Nerissa replies, "From both, my lord. Bellario greets your grace." And he gives Nerissa, because now she's disguised as a clerk, gives him a letter. And Nerissa says, "Yes, I am from both." And the letter is given to the letter. Shylock sharpens. Meanwhile, Shylock is seen to sharpen a knife on the bottom of his shoe. He's getting ready to extract his pound of flesh. Once again, Shylock sharpens a knife, and Bassanio asks Shylock as to why he is sharpening his knife so eagerly, because it's not a happy thing for anyone to cut out a pound of flesh from another human being. And Shylock, being Shylock, he says, "It is to cut the forfeiture from that bankrupt there." He points at Antonio, he looks at Antonio, and he says, to get what is owed to me of that man who is bankrupt, standing over there." And immediately you find Gratiano saying, "Not on thy soul, but on thy soul, harsh Jew. Thou makest thy knife keen, but no metal can, no, not the hangman's axe, bear half the keenness of thy sharp envy. Can no prayers pierce thee?" Now, Gratiano says, "You should not be using your shoe sole to sharpen your knife, because your shoe sole is quite hard, but what is harder is your heart, your soul. Your soul is hardened, and it is better to sharpen your knife on your hardened soul," he says. "But no blade, not even the executioner's axe, is half as sharp as your sharp envy. Can no prayers pierce your stubborn heart?" He says, is there nothing that can change your heart?" He says, "Not even the person who is the executioner is a person who executes you. He's a person who brings death to you, and his axe is supposed to be the sharpest." But he says, even the executioner's axe is not as sharp as your envy, because you envy Antonio, and that is why you hate Antonio. And he asks him, Graciano asks him, can there be, is there any prayer that can change your heart, your stubborn heart? Can no prayers pierce thee? Shylock says, "No, none that thou hast wit enough to make." He says, "Yeah, no, There are no prayers that you are smart enough to make. There is nothing. There is no prayer. There is no plea that's going to change my mind. These lines are extremely important. Now, Shylock tells Graciano that there are no prayers that's going to change his mind. And Graciano says, "O be thou damned inexecrable dog, and for thy life let justice be accused. Thou almost makest me waver in my faith to hold opinion with Pythagoras that souls of animals infuse themselves into the trunks of men. Thy currish spirit governed a wolf who hanged for human slaughter, even from the gallows did his fell soul fleet, and while thou layest in thy unhallowed dam, infused itself in thee, for thy desires are wolfish, bloody, starved, and ravenous." Now Grashanio insults Shylock and calls him a dog. He says, "Oh, damn you, relentless dog." And he says, "For thy life let justice be accused." When he says, "I hope justice comes to you," it's almost like, karma. You're going to get everything that you deserve, he says. And he says, seeing seeing the way that you work in life has almost made me change my mind. Your vampish, your meanness in your approach to other men has made me change my mind and agree with Pythagoras, because according to Pythagoras, he believed that souls of animals enter the bodies of men. And he says, you have that you have the spirit of a dog, of a wolf. And he says, governed, thy courage spirit governed a wolf. Your soul has been overtaken by that of a wolf who was hanged for human slaughter. That wolf that was killed for killing a human. But even as it was being killed, its soul left its body. His fell soul fleet, and while thou layest in thy unhallowed dam, and while you were in your mother's pregnant belly, the soul of that wolf entered into you. And he says that is the only explanation for the reason why you behave in such a manner. He says, your desires are wolfish. It is bloody, starved, and ravenous, and therefore you can be nothing but such a person with the soul of a dog, or rather a wolf, a bloodthirsty wolf, because that is the only thing that makes sense, because there is no humanity. You are not humane. You have no compassion. For the life of another person, he says. And this is where Shylock, who's been listening to all this insult, replies. He is rather unmoved. He's not touched by anything. Shylock responds, and his response silences Graciano. You will see that in the next clipping. Change him or change his mind. He says, "Till thou canst trail the seal from off my bond, thou but offends thy lungs to speak so loud." So Shylock says, unless you can rip the official seal of my contract. Now while we were there is this seal on my contract, unless you can somehow manage to take that seal of my contract, all you're doing is simply hurting your lungs by shouting at me. There is nothing else that you're doing. You're simply hurting yourself, because there is nothing much you can do about it. Repair thy wit, good youth, or it will fall to cureless ruin, and I stand here for law. He says, take care of your mind, young man, or it will fall apart with time. He says, I support the law. So now this is a good reply to Graciano. He says there is absolutely no point in simply shouting at me or cursing me, because all you're doing is simply wasting your time and energy. What I want is something legal. It is legally bound, and I have a contract which says that that I should be given a pound of flesh, and that is exactly what I want. And unless, of course, you can take off that official seal from the contract, you're simply wasting your time by shouting at me. So now he silences Graciano, and now it is a duke. The duke reads the letter. He says, "This letter from Bellario doth commend a young and learned doctor to our court. Where is he? Nerissa. He attended here hard by, to know your answer whether you will admit him." Now the Duke is quite pleased with the letter. He's been reading this for quite some time, and he says, this letter from Bellario, the Duke says, this letter from Bellario recommends a young and well educated doctor of law. Now, where is this man? He says. So Nerissa says, he is waiting nearby. He wants to know whether you will allow him into the court, whether you will admit him. The Duke, who has been worried all this while, he says, "With all my heart, some 3 or 4 of you go give him courteous conduct to this place. Meantime, the court shall hear Bellario's letter." With all my heart, I let him in. 3 or 4 of you go and be extremely courteous. You welcome this man, and in the meantime, this court will hear. I'm going to read out Bellario's letter, and you can hear what this man says. He says, and then he reads the letter aloud. The clerk reads the letter. It is a clerk who is actually reading the letter. He says, "Your Grace shall understand that at the receipt of your letter I am very sick, but in the instant that your messenger came, in loving visitation was with me a young doctor of Rome. His name is Balthasar. I acquainted him with the cause in controversy between the Jew and Antonio the merchant. We turned over many books together. He is furnished with my opinion, which bettered with his own learning, the greatness whereof I cannot enough commend, comes with him at my importunity to fill up your Grace's request in my stead. I beseech you, let his lack of years be no impediment to let him lack a reverend estimation, for I never knew so young a body with so old a head. I leave him to your gracious acceptance, whose trial shall better publish his commendation." So this is a rather long letter. It is a letter of recommendation. Now the letter introduces the main concern, the fact that Bellario has not been able to come. He says he has been very sick. I am very sick, but in the instant that your messenger came, in loving visitation, it just so happened when your messenger came to me, I happened to have a young lawyer visiting me from Rome, and that man's name is Balthasar. And I told him about this controversial case between Shylock the Jew and Antonio the merchant. And together we consulted, we turned over many books together, meaning we consulted a lot of law books together. He knows my opinion on the matter, and which has been enriched by his own intelligence. So he's quite an intelligent young fellow, and then which I can't speak of highly enough. And he brings my opinion to you in my place, and he's there on my behalf, and he is going to represent me because he brings my opinion. And he says, I beg you, let his lack of years, meaning he's a young man, since he's very young, don't let his age make you underestimate him, because I never knew so young a body, meaning I have never seen such a young man with so much wisdom, with so old a head, meaning he has a lot of wisdom. I leave him to your gracious acceptance. And he says, I hope you will welcome him graciously, whose trial shall better publish his commendation. And he says, you will see how worthy of my recommendation he is. You will understand why I have recommended this particular person rather than come myself, because he is a wonderful person. And it is at that moment uh, you find Portia enters, but here Portia does not come as Portia Bassanio's wife. Instead, Portia comes dressed up as a man. Portia comes dressed up as Balthazar, disguised as a doctor of law. Now, because she comes dressed up as Balthazar, no one is able to, nobody is able to, nobody understands who this person is. The Duke, after he learns of Bellario, the letter that he has sent, he looks at Portia and says, "Give me your hand. Come you from old Bellario?" Portia says, "Yes, I have come from Bellario, my lord." The Duke welcomes her and says, "You are welcome. Take your place. Are you acquainted with the difference that holds this present question in the court?" He says, are you aware, are you familiar with the different sides of the case facing the court right now? There are two different parties, there are two opposite parties, and you know what it's all about. Portia says, I am informed thoroughly of the cause. Which is the merchant here and which the Jew? So she knows the case, and she says, I've been thoroughly informed about the case. Which one of these men is the merchant and which is the Jew? Duke immediately summons them. He says, Antonio and old Shylock both stand forth. He says, both of you come forward. Portia looks at Shylock and says, is your name Shylock? Shylock is the name. So he says, yes, I am Shylock. I am the person we will call Shylock. Portia says, of a strange nature is the suit you follow, yet in such a rule that the Venetian law cannot impugn you as you do proceed. You stand within his danger, do you not? And she looks at Antonio and says, you stand within his danger, do you not? So now Portia says, this is a very, you're pursuing a very strange case, and there is nothing under the Venetian law. The Venetian law says that whatever bond that you have signed, that is right. So we cannot stop you from proceeding. And then looks at Antonio and says, you stand within his danger, meaning you are at this man's mercy, are you not? So Antonio says, yes. He admits to it, and he says, yes. Do you confess the bond? So Portia asks Antonio, do you agree that you have signed this bond? And Antonio, being a very honest man, he says, yes, I do confess this bond. Then must the Jew be merciful? Then she looks at Shylock and says, then your only way out is if this Jew is merciful, he shows you some pity or mercy. And then she looks at Shylock, but Shylock of course refuses, and he says, on what compulsion must I? Tell me that. He says, why should I show mercy? On what compulsion must I? He says. Now Portia says, the quality of mercy is not strained. Now she says, mercy is something that no one is forced, no one can make you practice, no one can train you to show mercy. It is something natural. Mercy is a quality that comes from within you. And she says, it falls gently, it falls easily, it droppeth as the gentle rain from heaven upon the place beneath. It is twice blessed. It blessed him that gives and him that takes. So now she talks about this quality of mercy, and she says, mercy is something that is natural. And she says, it is a unique quality, and she says, it falls easily and naturally like the gentle rain from the sky. And she says, it is twice blessed. There is a double blessing. When you show mercy, it blesses both the person who shows mercy as well as the person that receives mercy. And she says, it is mightiest in the mightiest. She says, it is the most admirable quality in the most mightiest men. It looks, she says, it becomes a throned monarch better than his crown. It looks better on a king than his crown. So now she goes on to talk about the quality of mercy. Indirectly, what she's trying to say is that Shylock should show Antonio some mercy, and she says, his scepter shows the force of temporal power, the attribute to awe and majesty, wherein doth sit the dread and fear of kings. Mercy is something that looks better on a king than his crown. Now, a king's scepter. A king holds a scepter, and the scepter is a symbol of his power, earthly power. And this scepter, it makes people respect and fear him, but only respect and fear. But she says, mercy is above the power of scepter. Now, when the king holds scepter, it tells people about that man's power. It does not tell people about his capacity to open out his heart, the capacity to show mercy and pity for his people. Now, so she says, mercy, the quality of mercy is above the power of scepter, and she says, it dwells not in the hands but in the hearts of the kings. Now, it is above the sceptered ways. It is enthroned in the hearts of kings. It is an attribute to God himself. It is an attribute of God himself. God himself is the most merciful. You refer to God as merciful, the most merciful, and earthly power resembles God's power, and therefore Jew. And then Portia talks to Shylock and says, therefore Jew, though justice be thy plea, consider this, that in the course of justice none of us should see salvation. He says, and therefore Jew, although you are seeking justice, consider this. If God sought justice against all of us with no mercy, we would all go to hell, because nobody is perfect. And since you say you want justice, what if God also wants justice all the time? And what if God never showed any of us mercy? Then what would be our situation? All of us, he says, all of us would go to hell. And it says, we pray for mercy. We do pray for mercy, and that same prayer doth teach us all to render the deeds of mercy. We pray to God for mercy, and that same prayer, because we expect mercy from God, shouldn't we show mercy to others as well? You expect something from God, and shouldn't that same quality be available for other human beings? And the same prayer should teach us to show mercy to others as well. And this is what he's saying. I have spoke thus much to mitigate the justice of thy plea, which if thou follow the strict court of Venice, must needs give sentence against the merchant there. Now he says, yes, now this is what I have to say against your